The townsfolk whispered as she stepped off the train. "Can't speak, can't hear, what kind of wife is that?" But when a storm nearly drowned half the village, it was the silent bride who rallied the neighbors. And the man who once only forged iron, he learned to forge something far stronger with her hands in his. Welcome to Tales by Orion. Let's uncover what really happened. The letter arrived on a cool spring morning, its edges worn and corners softened from the long journey. Clara held it carefully, fingers tracing the familiar handwriting, though her heart beat wildly with a mix of hope and fear. She had waited months in that cramped eastern town, dreaming of a new life in the West, a place where no one judged her silence, where she could be more than the girl they called broken. The letter was from a man named Thomas, a blacksmith in a small frontier town, promising a fresh start, a chance to belong. For Clara, who had been rejected by nearly every family she had written to because of her deafness, this letter was a miracle. It spoke of strength, kindness, and a willingness to understand a world she lived in differently. She read the words again and again, committing them to memory. "I don't need words to know a good heart." Packing her few belongings, Clara prepared for the journey westward. The train ride was long and lonely, but she felt a quiet determination settling in her chest. When the train finally pulled into the dusty station, the wide open sky and the unfamiliar sounds of horses and wagons overwhelmed her senses. She squinted against the sunlight, searching for the man whose letter had promised her hope. Thomas stood near the blacksmith shop, his broad frame silhouetted against the rising smoke of the forge. His eyes met hers with steady calm, a smile breaking the seriousness of his weathered face. He approached without hesitation, hands open in welcome. Clara's lips curved in a shy smile, words unnecessary between them. Though she could not hear the clang of the hammer or the whispers of the wind, Clara sensed something different here, something that stirred a fragile hope inside her. This was a place where her silence might finally be seen, not as a barrier, but as a part of her whole. And as Thomas reached out to steady her trembling hand, the letter's promise began to take root, setting the stage for a story neither of them could yet imagine. Before Clara ever stepped foot on the train, rejection had already shaped her journey. Letters she sent in hope had come back with cold refusals, or worse, no reply at all. Most men seeking mail-order brides were clear about what they wanted, women who could hear, speak, and fit neatly into their idea of home. Clara's deafness, something she neither hid nor was ashamed of, was a barrier that many could not see past. In her small hometown, whispers followed her like shadows. Some said she was cursed, others believed she was fragile, and a few thought she was simply too different to be a wife. Yet Clara held tightly to the belief that beyond the judgment and silence, there was a place where she would be accepted. She learned to read lips and gestures, but the ache of loneliness remained. One letter stood out among the many refusals, the one from Thomas, a blacksmith living hundreds of miles away in the West. His words were simple but genuine. He didn't dwell on her deafness. Instead, he spoke of strength, hard work, and the quiet understanding he hoped to share. It was the first time someone saw her not as a problem to be fixed, but as a person to be known. Still, the journey ahead was uncertain. The day Clara left, neighbors gathered to watch the train whistle blow. Some nodded with sympathy, others looked away. Her mother pressed a small bundle into her hands, a token of love and hope wrapped in faded cloth. On the train, Clara watched the countryside blur past the window. Every mile brought her closer to a future she dared to imagine but had never dared to live. The faces of those who rejected her floated in her mind, but she forced them away, focusing instead on the letter she clutched like a lifeline. Rejection had come early and often, but it had not broken her spirit. Clara knew that to find belonging, she would have to carry the weight of silence and the strength to let someone else learn its language. The West awaited, a place where she might finally be more than her limitations. The train rumbled steadily westward, its wheels clattering over worn tracks that stretched into the horizon like a ribbon unraveling new possibilities. Clara sat by the window, her gaze distant as the landscape shifted from crowded towns to wide, open fields. Around her, passengers talked and laughed, their voices a steady hum she could only imagine. The silence she carried was both a comfort and a barrier, wrapping her in a world apart. She clutched the small leather-bound journal Thomas had sent with his letter, a place for her to write down questions, thoughts, and hopes. Her fingers traced the edges of the pages, each blank sheet a promise of connection she longed to build. The other travelers glanced curiously at the young woman who didn't respond to their greetings, but Clara was used to that. Words had never come easily, but she had learned to speak in other ways, through expression, through touch, and through patience. At night, as the stars flickered beyond the train's windows, Clara practiced the signs she had taught herself, fingers moving softly in the dim light. She thought of the blacksmith's forge and the man who waited, and she imagined the steady rhythm of hammer on metal, the way he might understand the quiet she carried. Her world was filled with silence, but it was not empty. It was a language shaped by experience and heart. The train slowed as it neared the small town, the air shifting with the scent of dust and pine. Clara felt a flutter in her chest, an anxious hope that mingled with fear. Would Thomas recognize her? Would he see past her silence? She folded the journal carefully, ready to share what words she could. Stepping onto the platform, the noise of life washed over her in waves. Children calling, horses neighing, wheels turning on dirt roads. She blinked against the bright sunlight, searching for the figure she had come to meet. There, near the forge's glowing window, stood Thomas, strong and steady, his eyes calm and kind. Clara took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the journey settle beneath her feet. The silence between them spoke louder than any words ever could. The blacksmith shop sat at the edge of town, its wooden walls stained dark by years of soot and fire. Inside, the air was thick with heat and the steady rhythm of hammer striking iron. Thomas moved with practiced ease, muscles rippling beneath worn sleeves as he shaped molten metal into tools, horseshoes, and the occasional delicate piece of jewelry. His world was one of work and quiet strength, measured by sweat and patience rather than words. When Clara stepped inside for the first time, the clang of the forge seemed to hush around her. The firelight flickered against her face, casting shadows that danced with her careful, deliberate movements. Thomas paused his work, wiping soot from his hands, and watched her with steady eyes. Not with judgment, but with a calm curiosity that made her feel less like a stranger and more like a visitor in a long-forgotten home. The shop was filled with tools of every shape and size, each telling a story of purpose and craft. Clara's gaze lingered on the worn leather apron hanging on the wall, the heavy bellows resting near the hearth, and the anvil scarred by countless strikes. It was a world built on quiet determination, much like her own. Thomas reached out slowly, offering her a roughened hand. She accepted it, feeling the warmth and strength in his grip. Words were unnecessary. Here, they would speak through actions and gestures. She pointed to the edge of her throat, then to her ear, signing simply deaf. Thomas nodded, his expression softening. He took a piece of charcoal and sketched a few basic signs on a scrap of paper. As the afternoon stretched on, Thomas showed her how the forge worked, the careful dance of fire and metal, the art of shaping something strong from raw beginnings. Clara watched closely, her hands resting on the cool wood of the workbench, learning to trust the rhythm of this silent world. Outside, the town carried on with its usual bustle, but inside the blacksmith shop, a new kind of understanding was forming, a quiet bridge between two lives shaped by patience, resilience, and the steady forging of something more than just metal. The morning light filtered softly through the dusty windows of the blacksmith shop when the bell above the door jingled unexpectedly. Clara looked up from where she was seated on a wooden bench, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her skirt. A stranger had entered, a tall man with a curious gaze and a slow, deliberate step. He paused just inside the doorway, taking in the scene. The forge's glow, the tools scattered about, and the quiet woman who sat watching the blacksmith. Thomas straightened and wiped his hands on his apron before stepping forward. The newcomer's eyes flicked between Thomas and Clara, lingering a moment longer on her, as if sensing there was more beneath the surface than silence. He cleared his throat, but no words came. Instead, he gave a respectful nod and gestured toward the blacksmith's anvil, asking about the work with simple signs and a few broken phrases. Clara watched their brief exchange, fascinated by the unspoken language forming between these two men. She could see Thomas's patience as he carefully explained the process, how the metal heated and cooled, how strength was born from fire and steady hands. The stranger listened intently, his face a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Then, unexpectedly, the visitor turned to Clara. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition, though neither spoke. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carved wooden figure, a horse, rough but skillfully made. He handed it to her with a gentle smile. Clara's fingers closed around the gift, the wood warm and smooth beneath her touch. She traced the figure's curves slowly, eyes brightening with a gratitude she could not yet express in words. The stranger nodded once, tipped his hat, and without another word, stepped back into the sunlight outside. Thomas watched the exchange with a knowing look. "People will come," he said softly, drawn by more than words. Clara nodded, feeling a quiet stirring deep inside her, a sense that her world was beginning to widen beyond the forge's heat and the silence she carried. An unexpected meeting had opened a new door, one she was only just beginning to understand. Days passed in a steady rhythm, marked not by spoken words but by gestures, glances, and the soft language of touch. Thomas and Clara moved through their days in the blacksmith shop and around the small town, slowly building a connection that grew stronger with each shared moment. Neither rushed. Both understood that true communication wasn't always found in sound. Thomas, patient and observant, began to learn Clara's ways, her signs, her expressions, the subtle shifts in her eyes that told stories deeper than any voice. He sketched words and phrases on scraps of wood and paper, teaching her the basics of the spoken world while discovering the beauty in her silent one. Clara responded in kind, her hands fluent and sure, her eyes brightening when he understood what she meant without a single sound. At the forge, their work intertwined like a dance. Clara brought Thomas water when the heat grew too fierce, her fingers lightly brushing his arm in encouragement. Thomas crafted a small wooden tablet, carved with simple symbols, so they could share thoughts when words failed. The townsfolk, initially wary of Clara's silence, began to notice the pair's quiet companionship. The way Thomas's rough hands cradled her with care, the way Clara's presence softened the sharp edges of his world. Evenings became a time of patient teaching and learning. By the firelight, Thomas traced letters on Clara's palm while she repeated the shapes with her fingers, the silent lessons binding them closer. They shared stories through drawings, through the rhythm of hammer strikes, through the gentle press of a hand. Words were unnecessary when trust and understanding filled the space between them. Outside, the town buzzed with gossip and curiosity, but inside their shared world, silence was a language of its own, rich, deep, and full of promise. Clara began to sense that in Thomas's quiet patience, she had found more than acceptance. She had found a voice, not heard with ears, but felt with the heart. And in that wordless exchange, something tender and unspoken took root, an understanding that sometimes the deepest conversations are spoken without a single sound. The village was small, its dirt roads winding between weathered wooden buildings and patches of untamed prairie. For years, life here moved to the steady rhythm of familiar faces and cautious traditions. But Clara's arrival stirred something new, and not everyone welcomed it. Whispers floated through the marketplace, carried on the wind like dry leaves rustling beneath worn boots. "That girl," some said, "she's different. Can't hear a word," they say. Others added, "Who would want a wife who can't speak? A blacksmith's life is hard enough without that burden." The words were soft but sharp, slicing through the quiet like knives hidden beneath smiles. Clara heard little of it. Her world was one of silence and gestures, but Thomas felt the weight. At the forge, a few customers lingered just long enough to drop cold greetings or hurried excuses to leave. The neighbors watched from porches, their eyes flickering with suspicion and thinly veiled judgment. One afternoon, as Clara swept the floor outside the shop, a group of townsfolk gathered nearby. Their voices hushed, but their glances were loud. Thomas approached slowly, the heat of the forge still clinging to his skin. He stepped between Clara and the crowd, his voice steady but low. "She's part of this town now," he said firmly. "If you want to know her, you'll have to look beyond what you don't understand." The crowd shifted uneasily, some nodding, others averting their eyes. Clara watched from the doorway, fingers tightening around her broom. She had learned to read the unspoken, the judgment, the fear, the loneliness. Yet beneath it all, there was curiosity, a slow stirring of something new. Some faces softened as they caught sight of her gentle smile, or the way she helped Thomas tend the horses or feed the children in town. That evening, Thomas found Clara sitting by the fire outside the shop. He knelt beside her, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "They'll talk," he said quietly, "but we'll show them who you really are." Clara's eyes met his, calm and steady. In the village whispers, she heard the first notes of a new song, one she was ready to sing, even without words. The forge was alive with warmth, the glow of molten metal casting flickering shadows across the worn walls. Thomas worked steadily, his hammer rising and falling with practiced precision, shaping raw iron into tools that would serve the town for years to come. Clara stood nearby, her fingers tracing the cool curves of a horseshoe she had just finished cleaning, the rhythm of the workshop settling into a gentle hum around them. There was a tenderness in the way Thomas handled his craft, each strike purposeful yet patient, as if the metal responded not just to force but to care. Clara watched him closely, learning the language of tools, the weight of a hammer, the dance of sparks, the delicate balance between strength and finesse. It was a world where silence felt natural, where actions spoke louder than words. Today, Thomas set aside a small piece of iron, carefully bending it into a simple pendant. He handed it to Clara, who turned it over in her hands, the cool metal pressing softly against her palm. It was shaped like a feather, a symbol of freedom and hope. She looked up, eyes meeting his, and the quiet smile they shared spoke volumes. Outside the shop, the town continued its busy life, but inside, there was a stillness that wrapped around them like a soft blanket. Clara brought water to Thomas when the heat became too fierce, their fingers brushing briefly, a fleeting connection that lingered long after. Thomas showed her how to stoke the fire, and she followed his movements carefully, eager to be part of this shared rhythm. In moments like these, the distance between them seemed to shrink, bridged by the simple acts of care and trust. Words were unnecessary. The tenderness in their gestures said all that needed to be said. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the forge cooled to embers, Clara sat by the door, cradling the feather pendant. The quiet world they were building together was fragile yet strong, forged not just from metal, but from patience, understanding, and a love that grew deeper with every silent moment shared. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet rhythm between Clara and Thomas deepened. But beneath the calm, both felt the unspoken walls that silence sometimes built. Clara longed to express the thoughts swirling inside her, to share dreams and fears beyond gestures and signs. Thomas, too, wrestled with the limits of their communication, words trapped behind a barrier he was only beginning to understand. One afternoon, as the sun poured golden light through the workshop window, Thomas brought out a small wooden box. Inside lay a set of carved tokens, simple shapes representing feelings, places, and memories. He handed one to Clara, a heart carved carefully from cherry wood. Her eyes widened, and slowly she traced the symbol, then looked up at him with a spark of something new. Hope. Encouraged, Thomas began to create more tokens, and together they built a vocabulary of objects and symbols that spoke their shared language. It was awkward at first, fumbling through meanings and missteps, but with patience, the tokens began to carry the weight of their stories. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of purple and rose, Clara brought out her own creation, a small notebook filled with sketches and symbols she had been drawing in secret. She flipped it open to a page where a simple drawing of a fire blazed, surrounded by two figures holding hands. Thomas's breath caught. It was their story, her silent way of breaking through the wall between them. Moved beyond words, Thomas took her hand gently in his, their fingers intertwining with a new strength. In that moment, the silence wasn't a barrier anymore. It was a space filled with understanding, trust, and something tenderly fierce. Outside, the village continued to whisper, but inside the forge, a quiet revolution had begun. Clara and Thomas had found a way to break through the silence, not by speaking, but by truly listening. Their connection was no longer defined by what was missing, but by everything they had discovered in the space between words. And in that shared silence, a deeper voice began to sing. At times, the past crept in like a shadow, stretching across the workshop floor, quiet but undeniable. Clara often found herself staring into the firelight, her mind tracing memories she rarely spoke aloud. The child at home where silence had once felt like a prison, the faces that had turned away when she couldn't hear their words, the loneliness stitched into years of feeling unseen. Thomas sensed these moments even without words. One evening, as the forge's glow dimmed to embers, he found Clara sitting outside beneath the vast night sky, the cool air carrying the scent of pine and earth. She looked up as he approached, eyes reflecting the stars, bright, distant, and full of stories. Without speaking, Thomas settled beside her. The quiet stretched between them, neither needing to fill it. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph, a faded image of a family, their faces warm with laughter. He handed it to Clara. She traced the edges with trembling fingers, understanding the gesture, a story shared, a bridge built from the fragments of their histories. Clara nodded, then took from her bag a folded scrap of paper, creased and fragile. It was a letter from her father, one she had never sent, words left unsaid and hopes left unfulfilled. Thomas took the letter carefully, reading the marks and signs she had added in the margins. Though he could not hear her past, he felt its weight, loss, longing, and the courage it took to leave it behind. That night, they sat close, the shadows of their past folding gently around them. Clara spoke through signs, slowly revealing pieces of her journey, moments of pain, but also of resilience. Thomas listened with steady eyes and open heart, sharing his own scars in silence. In the weaving of their histories, they found strength. The past was not a chain to bind them, but a shadow to acknowledge, then set aside. Together, they stepped forward, hand in hand, forging a future tempered by understanding and the quiet power of shared wounds healed in time. Clara's strength was often underestimated by those around her. To the village, she was quiet, silent, even, but beneath that stillness lay a resilience forged through years of navigating a world that rarely made space for her. It was a strength born not of loud defiance, but of steady endurance, patience, and a fierce determination to be seen on her own terms. One morning, as Thomas worked at the forge, a sudden storm rolled over the hills, sending rain pelting against the wooden walls. The horses grew restless in their stalls, and the town's people hurried indoors. Clara moved swiftly, her calm decisiveness guiding her steps. She tended to the animals, calming them with gentle touches and firm hands, moving with a grace that spoke of deep knowledge and quiet authority. Later, when the floodwaters swelled and threatened to overflow the creek, Clara was the first to organize a group of neighbors to reinforce the banks with sandbags. Without raising her voice, she led with gestures and determined eyes, her presence commanding respect. The villagers, once doubtful, now saw in her a strength that could not be ignored. Thomas watched her with pride swelling quietly in his chest. He had seen this strength in her from the start, not despite her silence, but because of it. Clara faced challenges with a steady heart, learning to speak in ways beyond words. It was a strength that spoke in the way she listened intently, understood deeply, and acted decisively. That evening, as the storm cleared and the sun dipped low, Clara and Thomas sat by the fire. She rested her hand on his arm, a silent promise of partnership and resolve. Her eyes held the unspoken knowledge that though the world might not always understand her, she carried within herself a power no storm could break. In that quiet moment, the village began to see Clara not as a silent outsider, but as a woman whose secret strength was the foundation of their new, shared life. Her silence was no weakness. It was the source of a courage that would shape their future together. The days grew longer and warmer, and with each sunrise, Clara and Thomas carved out a new life together, one neither had dared to imagine before. Their world was still small, built on the edges of frontier town, where every face was familiar and every step forward required courage. But together, they began forging a path that blended two lives shaped by silence, resilience, and quiet hope. At the forge, Thomas taught Clara more about his craft, the careful shaping of metal, the way fire could transform the raw and broken into something strong and useful. Clara listened with sharp eyes, her hands steady as she learned to work alongside him. In turn, she shared her own world, her silent language of signs, the subtle ways she read the world through touch and expression. Outside the workshop, they planted a small garden, breaking new soil with sturdy hands. It was a symbol of their commitment, a promise to nurture something fragile into bloom. Neighbors began to notice the change, not just in the land, but in the way the couple moved together, their steps aligned and sure. Some days were harder than others. Old prejudices lingered in quiet glances and whispered doubts. But Clara and Thomas faced them with steady hearts. They held each other through storms, both literal and those stirred by fear and misunderstanding. One afternoon, as the sun warmed the earth, Clara stood at the edge of the garden, fingers brushing over fresh shoots. Thomas joined her, placing a hand over hers. No words were spoken, but the weight of their shared dream filled the space between them. They were no longer just a blacksmith and a silent bride. They were partners, builders of a future forged in patience and love. Their path was not always easy, but it was theirs to walk, one step, one gesture, one shared breath at a time. And so, beneath the endless sky, Clara and Thomas forged a new life together, stronger than any metal, bound not by sound, but by the unbreakable ties of trust and hope. The days grew longer and warmer, and with each sunrise, Clara and Thomas carved out a new life together, one neither had dared to imagine before. Their world was still small, built on the edges of a frontier town, where every face was familiar and every step forward required courage. But together, they began forging a path that blended two lives shaped by silence, resilience, and quiet hope. At the forge, Thomas taught Clara more about his craft, the careful shaping of metal, the way fire could transform the raw and broken into something strong and useful. Clara listened with sharp eyes, her hands steady as she learned to work alongside him. In turn, she shared her own world, her silent language of signs, the subtle ways she read the world through touch and expression. Outside the workshop, they planted a small garden, breaking new soil with sturdy hands. It was a symbol of their commitment, a promise to nurture something fragile into bloom. Neighbors began to notice the change, not just in the land, but in the way the couple moved together, their steps aligned and sure. Some days were harder than others. Old prejudices lingered in quiet glances and whispered doubts. But Clara and Thomas faced them with steady hearts. They held each other through storms, both literal and those stirred by fear and misunderstanding. One afternoon, as the sun warmed the earth, Clara stood at the edge of the garden, fingers brushing over fresh shoots. Thomas joined her, placing a hand over hers. No words were spoken, but the weight of their shared dream filled the space between them. They were no longer just a blacksmith and a silent bride. They were partners, builders of a future forged in patience and love. Their path was not always easy, but it was theirs to walk, one step, one gesture, one shared breath at a time. And so, beneath the endless sky, Clara and Thomas forged a new life together, stronger than any metal, bound not by sound, but by the unbreakable ties of trust and hope. Life together was not without its challenges. Even as Clara and Thomas built their quiet world, moments arose that tested the patience and trust between them. Moments when the unspoken could feel like a gulf instead of a bridge. One afternoon, a shipment of tools arrived late, disrupting Thomas's careful schedule at the forge. Frustration tightened his jaw as he realized the delay might affect the town's blacksmith needs. Clara noticed the tension, the way his hands clenched and his brow furrowed. She wanted to help, but words escaped her. Instead, she approached quietly, placing a steadying hand on his arm. Thomas paused, the sharp edge of frustration softening as he looked into her calm, understanding eyes. Without speaking, Clara signed a simple phrase she had been practicing: "We face it together." The moment was a small but powerful reminder that their partnership went beyond spoken language. Thomas nodded, taking a deep breath, the weight easing from his shoulders. Later that week, a visitor came to the forge, a trader from a neighboring town. Curious about Clara, he asked pointed questions, his tone dripping with skepticism. Thomas answered firmly, defending her presence and their life without hesitation. Clara watched, pride swelling quietly inside her as she saw the strength in his support. Yet, there were also moments of quiet struggle. Clara grappled with the frustration of being misunderstood, the longing to express thoughts that could not easily be signed. Thomas, too, sometimes felt helpless, wishing he could fully bridge the silence that separated them from others. But each test was met with patience to listen, to learn, and to trust the bond they were building. They found ways to navigate obstacles not through grand gestures or speeches, but through consistent care and unwavering presence. By facing trials side by side, Clara and Thomas deepened their connection, proving that love, quiet, steady, and patient, could endure even the toughest tests. Their trust became a forge, strong enough to shape a future neither had dared hope for alone. Despite the growing strength of their bond, doubt began to creep quietly into Clara's thoughts. It arrived like a shadow at the edge of a sunny day, subtle but persistent. The village still whispered, and though Thomas stood unwavering by her side, she wondered if their life together could withstand the world's skepticism. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky in fading gold, Clara sat alone by the river's edge. The water moved silently, reflecting the unsettled turmoil inside her. She traced patterns in the dirt with her fingers, wrestling with the fear that maybe, despite all their efforts, she was still seen as an outsider. Thomas found her there, the firelight from his lantern casting soft glows on the worn path. He sat beside her, quiet but present, sensing the unrest even without words. Clara hesitated, then signed slowly. "Do you think they will ever accept me?" His hands reached for hers, firm and steady. Without speaking, he signed back, "I believe in us, in our strength." Yet doubt lingered. At the market the next day, Clara overheard hushed voices questioning her place in the town and the future she and Thomas were trying to build. How can she keep up? How can he manage with her silence? They whispered, doubt coloring their tone. The question stung, but Thomas refused to let them take root. That night, he sat beside Clara at the forge, holding her hand and reminding her, without words, that their life was theirs to shape. Still, the arrival of doubt was a test, not just of their love, but of their resilience. Clara realized that fear and uncertainty were parts of the journey, shadows they would have to face together. In the quiet between them, they found a new resolve. Doubt could knock at their door, but it would not define them. With patience, trust, and unwavering support, Clara and Thomas prepared to meet the challenges ahead, bound not by certainty, but by a love forged in silence and steadfast hope. In the days that followed, Clara and Thomas discovered a truth that only grew clearer with time. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than words ever could. Their quiet moments together, filled with small gestures and shared glances, carried a weight and meaning that no conversation might match. One afternoon, as the wind rustled the tall grasses outside the forge, Thomas sat beside Clara on a weathered bench. She traced patterns on his hand, each touch deliberate and full of meaning. Without a single word spoken, they shared their fears, hopes, and promises, an unspoken language more profound than any sentence. At the market, where doubt once lingered in whispers, neighbors began to notice the strength in their silence. It was in the way Thomas paused to listen carefully to Clara's signs, in the patient kindness that shaped every interaction between them. Their quiet presence became a statement, a testament to love that did not need to shout to be heard. One evening, a sudden storm swept through the town. The wind howled, and the rain fell in torrents, forcing villagers to seek shelter. Clara and Thomas worked together, securing windows and helping neighbors without a word exchanged beyond the essentials. Their coordinated efforts, seamless and calm, spoke volumes to those who watched. Later, as the storm passed and the stars emerged, Clara rested her head against Thomas's shoulder. The silence between them was warm, filled with the comfort of understanding that required no explanation. Thomas squeezed her hand gently, signing, "Your silence is strength." Clara smiled, the depth of her gratitude shining in her eyes. In a world that prized noise and haste, they had found peace in stillness. Their love, forged in the quiet spaces between words, grew louder than any voice. It was a reminder that sometimes the deepest connections are not spoken but felt, in every look, every touch, every shared breath. And as the village slowly embraced their story, Clara and Thomas knew that when silence speaks louder, it echoes forever. Over time, the small town began to soften, its wary eyes turning toward curiosity and, eventually, acceptance. The quiet strength Clara and Thomas embodied slowly chipped away at old prejudices, revealing a community capable of growth and compassion. It started with small gestures, neighbors offering fresh bread at the doorstep, children lingering a little longer to watch Clara weave baskets or Thomas mend tools. The local schoolteacher, once hesitant, invited Clara to help with lessons, recognizing the unique perspective she brought to the children's learning. At the weekly market, hushed whispers shifted into nods of approval. The townsfolk saw not just a silent bride and her blacksmith husband, but partners who worked side by side, their lives intertwined with care and respect. One afternoon, during the town's annual harvest festival, Clara stood nervously among the gathered crowd. Her hands twisted a handkerchief, unsure if she belonged. But as Thomas took her hand and led her forward, the murmurs quieted. The mayor stepped up and, with a smile, welcomed Clara as a valued member of their community. Laughter and music filled the air as neighbors invited her to join in dances and shared stories. Children tugged at her skirts, eager to learn her sign language, their innocent curiosity bridging gaps grown from years of misunderstanding. Thomas watched from nearby, pride glowing in his eyes. The journey had been long and uncertain, but the town's big heart was opening, embracing difference as a source of strength, not division. That evening, as fireflies dotted the dusky sky, Clara and Thomas walked home hand in hand. The silence between them was peaceful, no longer filled with tension or doubt. In the small town that once doubted, they had found a place to grow, a place where love could flourish beyond words, and hearts could open wide enough to hold even the quietest among them. Their story was proof that sometimes the smallest places hold the biggest hearts, ready to welcome those brave enough to belong. In a world where words often failed Clara, the language of touch became their most profound connection. Each brush of a hand, Each gentle press of a finger spoke volumes that speech never could. It was a language built from trust, comfort, and love, a vocabulary written in skin and silence. One crisp morning, Thomas found Clara tending to a wounded bird beneath the shade of the old oak tree. She cradled it carefully, fingers delicate yet assured. Watching her, Thomas realized how much of her strength was conveyed through her hands. The way she healed not only creatures but hearts, too. Back at the forge, their hands worked side by side. Thomas shaping iron, Clara smoothing leather straps for reins. When his fingers brushed against hers, a spark of warmth passed between them, a silent promise of presence and support. That evening, as twilight settled over the town, Clara reached out to Thomas in a way she had never dared before. Her fingertips traced the lines of his weathered face, memorizing every curve and scar. Thomas closed his eyes, leaning into the touch, feeling seen in a way no words could capture. Their connection grew deeper through these shared moments, when Thomas would tuck a stray lock of hair behind Clara's ear or when she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. The language of touch was intimate and unspoken, a constant conversation that needed no translation. Neighbors began to notice the quiet tenderness between them, a gentle love that radiated from simple gestures rather than grand declarations. It was a reminder that communication isn't always about speaking loudly, but about being present and understanding in the spaces between. In the stillness of their shared touch, Clara and Thomas found a world rich with meaning, a love that transcended sound and language, rooted deeply in the warmth of connection. And so, their lives wove together in silent harmony, speaking the language of touch that only hearts fluent in love could truly understand. Despite the quiet acceptance growing in the town, prejudice still lingered beneath the surface, like embers waiting to spark. One afternoon, as Clara and Thomas worked together in the forge, a group of men from a neighboring settlement rode in, their faces hard with suspicion. They questioned Thomas sharply about why he had taken in a deaf woman, their words edged with judgment. How could she keep up? How will she manage the hardships of this life? One sneered, casting a dismissive glance toward Clara. Thomas stood tall, his voice calm but firm as he answered. Clara is strong in ways you don't understand. She's more capable than many who speak without thought. He gestured to Clara, who met the men's eyes with steady confidence, her silence speaking volumes. The visitor scoffed, but Thomas did not back down. He explained how Clara's strength, patience, and insight had been a gift to him and the community. Prejudice is the easy path, he said, but it blinds you to the truth. Clara's silence is not weakness, it's resilience. Slowly, the tension eased as the men observed Clara's quiet determination and the way Thomas trusted her implicitly. Some softened, nodding with reluctant respect. Others left in silence, the weight of Thomas's words lingering in the air. After they had gone, Clara and Thomas stood side by side, their hands clasped tightly. The challenge had been real, but together they had faced it unflinchingly. In the days that followed, stories of their steadfastness spread through the town and beyond. Their courage inspired others to reconsider their own biases and open hearts that had long been closed. Clara understood that standing against prejudice was an ongoing battle, not one with a single confrontation, but with countless quiet acts of strength and love. With Thomas by her side, she felt ready to meet whatever came next. Together, they were a living testament that courage could break down walls built by fear and misunderstanding. And in their union, the town found not division, but the seeds of unity, proof that standing against prejudice is the first step toward true acceptance. As dusk settled over the town, the blacksmith's workshop transformed into a sanctuary of quiet and warmth. The glow from the forge softened in the dim light, casting long shadows that danced across the worn tools and wooden beams. Inside, Thomas and Clara moved with a gentle rhythm, their presence filling the space with a peaceful harmony that only deep understanding could create. The day's work was done, but the forge still hummed softly its embers glowing like captured stars. Thomas tended the fire carefully, his hands steady and sure, while Clara sat nearby, weaving leather strips into a small pouch. Their silence was comfortable, a language forged in countless shared moments where words were unnecessary. Tonight, the world outside seemed far away, the distant sounds of the town fading beneath the steady crackle of the fire. Thomas looked over at Clara, her face illuminated by the warm light, eyes focused and serene. Without a word, he reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The simple touch spoke of affection, trust, and a love that had grown quietly but fiercely. Clara responded by resting her hand on his wrist, feeling the strength and calm in his pulse. Together, they sat in the hush, the night wrapping around them like a protective cloak. In this sacred space, the weight of the day's challenges lifted, replaced by the comfort of shared solitude. Thomas pulled out a small wooden box, presenting it to Clara with a soft smile. Inside was a new set of carved tokens, symbols they had created to bridge their silent conversations. She picked up a token shaped like a flame, tracing its curves thoughtfully. Their hands met as they exchanged meanings, a silent dialogue that deepened their bond. As the night wore on, the workshop became more than a place of labor. It was a refuge where two souls intertwined, finding peace in the quiet glow of the forge. And beneath the stars outside, Clara and Thomas discovered that sometimes the most powerful stories are told not in words, but in the gentle light of understanding shared in the stillness of night. The morning sun filtered softly through the workshop window, casting gentle beams that warmed the dust motes dancing in the still air. Clara stood near the anvil, her fingers tracing the smooth curve of a newly forged horseshoe. Thomas was nearby, sharpening a blade, his focus steady, but his eyes occasionally drifting toward her. Suddenly, their hands brushed, a fleeting touch that seemed to hold the weight of everything unspoken between them. Clara looked up, her eyes meeting Thomas's, and in that moment, a silent current passed through the space, deep and undeniable. No words were needed. The years of learning each other's rhythms, the patience through misunderstandings, and the steady presence during storms all converged into a moment of pure connection. Thomas slowly reached out, cupping Clara's hand in his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. She squeezed his hand softly, a gesture filled with gratitude and trust. They had traveled far, not just in miles, but in understanding. The barriers of silence, the doubts, and the judgments had not broken them. Instead, they had forged something stronger. Thomas signed with deliberate care. "I see you. I hear you, even when there are no words." Clara's smile was radiant, a light that spoke louder than any voice. She returned the sign, "And I know you," in ways beyond sound. Their eyes held the promise of countless silent conversations yet to come, a future built on deep respect and unwavering love. Outside, the town began to stir, but inside the workshop, time seemed to pause. In that small space, two souls had found true understanding, an unbreakable bond woven from patience, kindness, and the courage to embrace difference. It was a quiet triumph, a whispered victory over fear and misunderstanding. And as Clara and Thomas stood together, hand in hand, they knew this moment was the foundation of everything they would build, a life where silence was not absence, but the richest language of all. Their love had grown quietly, like a slow-burning flame that needed no loud declarations to prove its strength. For Clara and Thomas, love was found in moments beyond sound, in the gentle brush of fingers, the steady gaze across a crowded room, the shared breath during long evenings by the fire. One afternoon, as the town bustled with preparations for the harvest festival, Clara and Thomas stole a few moments alone beneath the sprawling branches of the old oak tree. The dappled sunlight played across their faces as they sat close, hands intertwined without a word spoken. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, delicate flower, wild and simple. He tucked it behind Clara's ear, his touch tender, speaking volumes without a single sound. Clara's eyes shone with a warmth that needed no translation. Their love was a language written in silence and trust, shaped by challenges faced and overcome together. It was found in the patience of learning to listen beyond hearing, to understand beyond speaking. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in soft purples and golds, Clara rested her head against Thomas's shoulder. The world around them faded away, replaced by the quiet assurance of belonging. Neighbors who once questioned their union now smiled with genuine affection, recognizing that love needed no perfect voice to be true. Children mimicked Clara's signs, eager to share in the silent poetry she brought to their lives. In their shared silence, Clara and Thomas discovered a love that transcended sound, a love as profound as any song, as steady as the forge's fire. It was a reminder that sometimes the deepest bonds are formed not through words, but through presence, patience, and unwavering care. And beneath the vast, endless sky, their hearts beat together in a rhythm only they could hear, a love beyond sound, infinite and unbreakable. The seasons turned, and the small town began to change, not just in the shifting colors of the fields, but in the hearts of its people. What had once been cautious glances and whispered doubts grew into open smiles and shared moments. Clara and Thomas had become more than just the quiet couple at the edge of town. They were a part of the community's very fabric. One bright morning, as preparations for the annual harvest feast filled the air with the scent of baked bread and fresh fruit, neighbors gathered at the blacksmith's workshop. Children laughed as they tried to mimic Clara's graceful signs, while adults exchanged stories of the couple's kindness and quiet strength. Thomas worked the forge, crafting tools needed for the celebration, while Clara moved among the crowd, helping where she could, tying ribbons on baskets, arranging flowers, and sharing smiles that warmed even the coldest hearts. The mayor stepped forward during the midday gathering, his voice carrying pride as he spoke of the town's growth and resilience. "We are stronger because of each other," he said, glancing toward Clara and Thomas. "Their love and patience have taught us all the meaning of community." Applause rippled through the crowd, not just for the couple, but for the spirit of unity that was blossoming. For the first time, Clara felt truly seen, not just as a silent bride, but as a valued neighbor and friend. As the sun dipped low, families gathered around long tables laden with food. Stories were shared, songs were sung, and the barriers that once divided them seemed to melt away in the glow of shared laughter. Thomas caught Clara's hand beneath the table, their fingers entwined, a silent reminder of the journey they had taken together. Around them, the community had come together, bound not by words alone, but by kindness, acceptance, and a shared hope for a better tomorrow. And in that warm evening light, Clara and Thomas knew their quiet love had become a beacon, guiding a small town toward a future built on understanding and togetherness. Years had passed since Clara first stepped off the train into the unknown. Now, the blacksmith's workshop was not just a place of labor, but a home filled with warmth, laughter, and the quiet rhythms of shared life. Their love, forged in silence and tempered by patience, had grown into something unbreakable. Morning light spilled through the windows, casting a golden glow on the tools neatly arranged and the worn wooden floor polished by countless footsteps. Thomas worked at the forge, the steady beat of his hammer echoing the pulse of their life together. Clara sat nearby, her hands busy weaving a basket, fingers deft and sure. Their days were woven with simple joys, tending the garden, sharing meals with neighbors, teaching the children sign language so that everyone could join the conversation. The town had embraced them fully, their once whispered doubts replaced by stories of resilience and love that inspired all who heard. Clara and Thomas had learned that love was not measured by words spoken, but by the depth of understanding and the willingness to stand together through every storm. Their silence was not emptiness. It was a language rich with meaning, filled with gestures, touches, and looks that spoke louder than any voice. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, hands clasped, watching the flames dance. Sometimes, Clara would rest her head on Thomas's shoulder, and in those moments, the world outside faded away, leaving only the warmth of connection and the steady beat of two hearts intertwined. Their journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it had led them to a life that was theirs alone, built on trust, respect, and an unspoken promise that neither silence nor sound could ever break. As stars glittered in the vast night sky, Clara and Thomas knew their story was one of quiet triumph, a life forged in silence and love, enduring and beautiful beyond words.